Just to make this very clear, the major lever that franchisees have to be a better business, to produce more money, is to basically squeeze wage costs.
Yeah.
Wow.
And you can see, in the and this is something again franchises are very open about. Is I think there's a quote in the book that's from another book called Franchise Dreams about a franchisor look, an entrepreneur makes the worst franchisee. You don't want someone who's an independent thinker who has their own business ideas. And similarly, Ray Kroc said, it doesn't take any particular aptitude or intellect to make it in one of our restaurants. It just takes grit and hard work. And he wanted workers. As a matter of fact, he sought out people who really needed this. His first investors in McDonald's were his friends from like the country club. Oh yeah, it's a nice investment opportunity. I'll put in some money and sure I'll manage the restaurant in my spare time. It didn't work out. They didn't put in the work. And so he found people who were a little more scrappy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal.
Joe, I will fully admit, I think I have a romanticized view of fast food chains.
Yeah, you're the only one.
Yeah, I know.
No, I mean, literally.
I know. I
like fast food chains. I don't have a romanticized view of them.
I blame Coming to America
the
restaurant that was in there, and also my overseas upbringing that probably made American fast food seem a lot more exotic and interesting than it perhaps actually is. But I was thinking the other day about the franchise model. It is really weird once you start digging down to it, because the way it's always portrayed, and it's like this in Coming to America, is you have the small business owner. Yeah. They want to be all entrepreneurial, so they get this franchise. Yeah. But then everything is basically dictated to them about how to do the business by the actual franchise, the corporate franchise owner.
Wait, in Coming to America, he didn't open a McDonald's.
No.
He opened a McDonald's.
But it was,
Right. But but that was the whole thing. There was like a legal fight against, because they claimed that like he wanted to do it his own.
It's a good memory, Joe.
I mean, he really just wanted to commit intellectual property theft. I mean, that's really what was going on.
It's
I suppose you could tell an optimistic version is he wanted to go his own way and do his own thing, but he was really just committing.
It's a perfect summary of why people are interested in the franchise model, which is like, okay, you're ostensibly supposed to be your own business person, I guess, independent, but you get a leg up because you get that like built-in customer base and the existing brand and all of that.
But to your point, like the pitch in many franchise-esque relationships, it's like, this is your chance to be an entrepreneur, et cetera. Except when you think about entrepreneurship, you don't think about like so many constraints. Like, here's the thing, and here's the price, and here's the thing, And also, in a typical entrepreneurial environment, there is quite a bit of like, people often go into entrepreneurship for like big, like right tail outcomes, So, for example,
the big payoff, right?
Yeah, and so like, for example, I remember, I guess you still hear it, but in like the glory days of like Uber and stuff like that, or being like an Amazon van driver or something like that, they talk about start your own business. And on some level, it was like on paper, it's like that was legally a business. But what is that? It's not going to be like a high scale, high margin business the way many people hope for when they do, quote, entrepreneurship, unquote. The sort of like parameters of the outcome. It's like, okay, maybe they've taken off some of like the really bad outcomes, but it's not the sort of like really good right tail outcomes that many people associate with like the aspirations of the entrepreneur.
Well, this is the other thing I'm interested in, because certainly in the 80s and 90s, you would hear stories about people who became relatively wealthy by running like franchise empires.
Totally.
So I'm curious if that still exists. But the other thing that's really interesting to me is like, okay, you're an independent owner of a franchise. What levers do you actually have to pull to improve the business?
I know. I always think like sometimes you see those stories, again, not to keep picking on McDonald's, which we both love, but like you'll see these stories from time to time about like a bad product rollout, right? They introduce a new sandwich and nobody likes it or something like that. And I always think, man, it would be so annoying to be a franchisee.
Yeah, you have to
be at the whims of some, like, how much do they have to carry the sandwich? Can they change the price? Like, you're really putting a lot of faith and money on people out who like make big decisions that are, or you like, let's say you run a bad ad, right? Let's say you run an ad that McDonald's corporate runs an ad that tarnishes the whole brand, which could theoretically happen. And it's like you've just like totally outsourced some of your future outcomes.
Or a CEO seems reluctant to eat their own meal product.
Oh, yeah,
I remember that.
right, that's right.
Okay, well, we should talk about, I guess, the franchise model and the franchise economy, because it is really interesting.
Yeah, we've never done an
episode. So I am happy to say we have the perfect guest. We're going to be speaking with Brian Kalachi. He is the chief economist at the Open Markets Institute and author of the book Chains of Command, The Rise and Cruel Reign of the Franchise Economy. So Brian, thank you so much for coming on All Thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Excited to talk about franchises. Can you maybe just give us an overview, like the actual legal and corporate structure of a franchise? What does it look like, and how does it differ from, I guess, either like
McDowell's?
McDowell's, yeah, there we go.
Yeah. So the legally, it's a very simple structure. It's really an artifact of trademark law. So you've got a brand owner, a McDonald's, let's say. And they license, ostensibly, we can get into how independent they really are, but an independent business owner to run a McDonald's restaurant and use a McDonald's trademark. And in exchange, the franchisee, both the operator called the franchisee, kicks a percentage of their sales and royalties, usually between 6 or 20%. And so McDonald's takes that revenue stream, and in return, also the franchisee, this is the key sticking point, agrees to follow all of their instructions. And it is quite minute. I mean, everything from in many cases, even the prices, hours of operation, product mix. And even things like, how long does your employee have, to serve as a customer in the drive-thru? What words do they use to greet the customer? There's very little left to discretion of the franchisee. They're basically a middle manager for a large corporation, but with a little bit more risk, and a little more skin in the game because of that, the way that the structure of it works.
They even constrain the equipment you can use to repair ice cream machines, right?
That is a famous example of franchisees. I'm an avid consumer of fast food.
Okay,
I love it. As a consumer, I love it. But yeah, that's a joke among us McDonald's fans is their ice cream machines are always broken.
Do you remember we did that episode a couple of years ago, and the guy who we were talking to was bullish on that company that makes the ice cream gear, but he was very straightforward, which I respected. It was he's like, they have the monopoly, their equipment breaks a lot, and only they can repair it. And so that's that's how investors should be thinking.
A popular business model, especially in the tech world where we see companies create problems that only they can solve. Anyway, okay, so you mentioned skin in the game there. Give us the sort of origin story of the franchise model, because my understanding is part of this was about incentives, right? So you tell people, well, you're not just going to be like a person working for us, you're actually going to have ownership in this particular restaurant and the revenue that it's throwing off. You want to incentivize people to, I guess, work harder for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it solves, what we economists call the principal agent problem. Where you have the local manager more incentivized to exert effort to put in work than a salaried employee would be, because their life savings depend on it. They invested their family's money in that restaurant or that other whatever kind of business it is. But the other reason why franchising was so appealing to these franchisors, is that the fact that they were a separate business, they were not employees of the chain, meant that they were covered by overtime or minimum wage, or if the McDonald's workers wanted to join a union or something like that, they weren't able to do so. They had no rights against McDonald's. All of their rights are only against this franchisee who really doesn't have the money. The money's all sort of coming to the top. So that legal barrier acts as sort of a legal barrier to exclude franchisees from from workers from those rents. And then the other aspect I would say, again, back to those incentives, is that what are these franchisees incentivized to do? As I was researching the book, I met someone. I'm from New England, so Dunkin' Donuts is our big chain. And someone who had worked at a Dunkin' Donuts said, "Yeah, my franchisee was obsessed with bananas." And I'm like, "Why bananas?" And so, well, because all the other ingredients, were controlled by Dunkin' Donuts, but bananas, he could send us around to look at the Stop and Shop, for the cheapest banana. So there was that aspect of it. So they're highly incentivized because nothing else is under their control. Pretty much what they do outside of bananas is they extract effort and push down wages for their franchised employees. So it's a high stress, a high, if you've ever been to one, very high motivated workforce. The phrase that workers at these restaurants uses, their manager always tell them, if you can lean, you can clean. You always got to be doing something.
Yeah.
So that, yeah.
All right. So that explains the sort of, we'll flesh it out too, the corporate logic. What is like the history of it?
Yeah.
Who are the real like innovators? We've just mentioned Dunkin' and McDonald's, but who were like the early players? What did they realize? What were the conditions, et cetera? Tell us about that period.
Yeah, so the initial legal structure comes out of like auto dealers and like these manufacturing companies in the 19th and early 20th century. But the fast food and modern franchising as we know it, where you have that your licensee like an entire business package to a small entrepreneur, that really dates to the post-war period, 1950s, 1960s. And the innovators who invented this business model they are fascinating. It was a joy to research the book. Very colorful people. Colonel Sanders was a real guy. Ray Kroc, there's a movie about him. It's fantastic with
his autobiography is very good.
Yes,
I've read
that's also excellent. Yeah, a lot of quotes from there in my book because he's such a verbose guy. But I'm an economist, and so I just started looking. I just wanted to know a little bit of the background so I could run my regressions, But as I, got deep into the history, like I decided I really wanted to write a book about how it was founded. And it's very fascinating because these guys had a great idea, but they also they said this openly. There's no secret to unearth. They said pretty clearly, what we're doing isn't really legal. We need to change the laws to make it legal. Let's form an association, a trade association, an international franchise association to make this business model legal. And the body of law that actually they went up against, it's kind of hard to believe now, but it was antitrust. Antitrust law protected these small business owners from that kind of control. Antitrust, has these sort of,
In like would the issue be that under a prior regime, a McDonald's or a franchisor would be the monopoly seller of McDonald's IP and so forth to all their how did this run up against franchise or antitrust law?
Yeah, so a lot of the case law actually comes from the petroleum industry, petroleum refiners who had branded stations, like a Shell station or a Chevron, and they came up with a way to get around chain store taxes and also antitrust to control the independent dealers, make sure they're only selling Shell oil and also only selling approved brands of batteries and tires and other accessories. So but they also did this to avoid when the Fair Labor Standards was passed in 1938, Ray Kroc and Colonel Sanders and all these founders of the franchise. Well, we should do that in service industries, not just product distribution. But the antitrust body of law was sort of like 19th century anti-monopoly idea of there's meaning to being owning a business, owning your own farm, or employment is is you can't have a democratic society where people are taking commands from someone else. So the antitrust courts through the mid 1970s are still enforcing that. Not in every case, but for example, if McDonald's wanted to set the price of a Big Mac, that was against the law. If they wanted to tell franchisees what territories they could operate, that was against the law. And for example, there's a great moment that I've now talked about so many times that I've basically memorized the quote. There's a series of hearings in front of the Senate Antitrust Committee. There's a bunch of them in 1963, and then a more robust set in 1965, where you have the chair of the Senate Anti-Monopoly Committee, a guy named Jerry S. Cohen, who is he's across he's interviewing or questioning the president of the International Franchise Association, a guy named Monty Pendleton, and he can't really believe his ears that franchisors are trying to get away with this. He tells him, wait a minute, the argument that you're giving us for why we should allow this business model under antitrust is that it creates all these opportunities for independent business owners. It allows an independent man, and it's a very gendered thing here, but an independent man to be independent. But if he's told what products he has to sell, what price he has to charge, what operation he has to operate in, well, he's not really independent, is he? He's part of an integrated franchisor's operation. And franchisors themselves say repeatedly throughout this period, we're trying to get vertical integration by other means. We don't want to own the assets. We don't want to employ the workers. Those are risks we'd rather do without. We want the benefits of that control, but we really don't want to be held liable for it.
So somehow the franchisors are able to successfully argue that they should be, I guess, treated like single entities when it comes to antitrust law. But at the same time, they should be exempt from, I guess, the obligations and liabilities that would normally come with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's another, a few years before the hearing I just mentioned, the Teamsters Union was trying to organize worker gas station attendants. And they sent their guy to testify, and he complained about this. He called it double barrel immunity. So when you're going to antitrust courts, you tell them that you are a single entity. You're all just one company. So it's like logically impossible for you to violate the antitrust laws because that requires a conspiracy. Two people have to agree. But at the same time, when we try to organize your workers, you say, no, the labor laws don't apply. They're a totally separate company. They have, nothing to do with this. And, that was the 60s. The same thing happened in franchising, is happening in franchising. People remember the Fight for 15 whole thing a few years ago. So they've been able to win this. So far, they can just sort of have those two worlds stay separate. And it's interesting they've been able to do that for so long.
So, okay, I see it in one version of it. The parent company or the franchisor has taken a lot of risk off the table. They don't have to make as many capital investments. They don't have to worry about their employees going on strike. On the other hand, if I'm any franchisee enters into this voluntarily, right? Like no one has to open a McDonald's, and so they're can see the risk rewards. The McDonald's will ensure, I believe, or the franchisor will ensure that, say, another one isn't going to open up on the same block, which is a risk if an independent business, right? I open up my own independent pizza shop. Someone opens one the next door, suddenly they undercut me, et cetera. So it's I don't have the risk of another McDonald's undercutting me.
You could still have a McDowell's.
You could have a McDowell's. But since we're talking about brands, there is McDonald's brand affinity in a way that many independent burger shops have either have yet to or never achieve. So at least some of these sort of classical business risks are taken off the table for the franchisee. And also it's my understanding, generally McDonald's franchisees have done very well and they're consistently quite profitable.
Yeah.
Is this an all fair characterization?
Well, a lot of that is fair. Yeah. And I'll elaborate a little bit. Yeah. It is, particularly if you got in with McDonald's at the beginning, if you're on the ground floor with these, I think it's fair to say, Ray Kroc, he allowed his franchisees to get rich before he did. That's a brag that the company does. It's kind of true. So there definitely was that. There was that dynamic. On the other hand, there are some chains that don't give that protection. For example, Subway is an example of one where they will open one up across the street from you.
Really?
Or if there was some litigation in the past with, let's say, Church's Chicken merges with Popeyes. Well, the contract might protect the Church's, but they could put a Popeyes across the street from you. So there is still some of that risk. But if you have any more Marxist inclined listeners, there's this everyone
we have a few.
Who's a worker. It's someone who doesn't have access to the means of production, so they have to sell their labor to a capitalist. But franchising has this whole other layer of these are people who can afford to open a restaurant. They have some capital. They supply capital as well as labor. They're investors, but they don't have the means of marketing at the scale that they don't have a brand. And so another thing you see in the whole history of franchising is franchisees saying, I kind of wanted to be an entrepreneur, or I used to own my own donut shop, but once Dunkin' Donuts, or at that time there was another chain called Mr. Donut, came to town, I really couldn't compete. I had to sell out, and join their chain. And that brand is very powerful. So there's this is even in the film. Ray Kroc famously, he stole they agreed to sell their whole business, basically, the McDonald brothers, the guys who created McDonald's, to him. And but after he controlled the McDonald's name and the trademark, they thought they could keep operating, and he just opened a McDonald's right across the street from their original place and put them out of business. And so that's something that you see, that brand is very powerful, but it also gives the franchisor power for the franchisee to do what they say.
I'm not surprised that McDonald's did this. When one of the facts probably the only fact that really sticks out at me from Ray Kroc's autobiography, where he's talking about his personal life. And he was in love with some woman, and in one sentence is oh, she was married at the time and I took her away from her husband, or it's one paragraph. So I was oh, he's very forthright about that. So I can't say I'm surprised that he opened up a McDonald's across the street from
a normal aside, but actually
a goal pursuing individual.
Yes.
Related to this, one thing I was very surprised to learn from your book is that there are no poaching agreements between McDonald's. So if I'm a worker at a particular McDonald's franchise and I want to go work for another one, I have to get the permission of my current franchise owner in order to do that.
Yeah, and they may have since dropped those, but they had them, and a lot of chains did for a very long time. And that sort of gets at this weird niche that they've been able to occupy in antitrust and labor law, where this is I think I would characterize it, I think, fairly as the absurdity of antitrust law, where there is this what is called the vertical horizontal distinction. And what that means is that for two McDonald's across town to pick up the phone and say, hey, don't hire any of my workers, I won't hire any of yours. That's a horizontal agreement. That is so illegal. You're going to face, you might go to jail for doing that. But if McDonald's from above tells them unilaterally, don't hire each other's workers, that puts it, it's not per se illegal. It gets put under what's called the rule of reason, which just means that now you have, it keeps people in my profession employed, but you have competing econometric reports. It's very difficult for a plaintiff, for a worker to challenge these kinds of no poach agreements, though they have tried, because it's very difficult to win, because that once it's vertical, now McDonald's can enter evidence that says, maybe, it has a bad effect on our wages, but, it helps us sell more hamburgers. Because again, we're a single entity.
Yeah.
We should have, this just makes it more efficient. And in that sense, low wages can be more efficient.
I think I'm just going to accept that we're just going to use McDonald's as like a stand-in for franchising. But let's say we're talking about McDonald's, some do very well, some maybe less so. Is there anything that the franchisee actually has discretion on that could either improve or lessen their odds of success?
Other than bananas at Dunkin' Donuts.
How hard they work, I think, is pretty much how hard they work. And I think the key to that is looking at what are they then incentivized to exert that effort towards. And it is because the one thing that McDonald's doesn't directly touch is, besides bananas, is their labor costs. So how big is your crew? Okay. Actually, the staffing requirements are even required. So how hard are they working? How low are their wages? And making sure everyone's
the owner doesn't have any discretion about the staffing levels?
No, staffing levels are mandated in the operations manual, which is incorporated into the contract and can be unilaterally changed at any time by McDonald's. So it's a very one-sided contract. I would, to be fair, the pro argument for that is that again, willing, consenting buyers and sellers, and it incentivizes those franchisees to follow the system and to work as hard as they possibly can.
Wait, sorry, just to make this very clear, the major lever that franchisees have to be a better business, to produce more money, is to basically squeeze wage costs.
Yeah.
Wow.
And you can see, in the and this is something, again, franchises are very open about, is I think there's a quote in the book that's from another book called Franchise Dreams, about, a franchisor look at entrepreneur makes the worst franchisee. You don't want someone who's an independent thinker who has their own business ideas. And similarly, Ray Kroc said, it doesn't take any particular aptitude or intellect to make it in one of our restaurants. It just takes grit and hard work. And he wanted workers. As a matter of fact, he sought out people who really needed this. His first investors in McDonald's were his friends from like the country club. Oh yeah, it's a nice investment opportunity. I'll put in some money and sure, I'll manage the restaurant in my spare time. It didn't work out. They didn't put in the work. And so he found people who were a little more scrappy,
There are constraints, or are there not? Like, let's say I wanted to open a McDonald's, but I didn't want to work hard. I just wanted an investment. Am I allowed to front someone else capital to do that? How does that work? I don't know. You never hear very much about say, I don't know, PE or finance, backing 1,000 new franchisees. Is that allowed?
Yeah. So a lot of the franchise contracts in my other work outside the book, a lot of this work joint with Marshall Steinbaum and Sergio Pinto, we actually coded, we read, hundreds of franchise contracts.
Yeah.
Those guys have since digitized, and they have thousands of contracts. And one key contract clause in across most chains is a personal obligation to work. So you are not allowed to be a passive investor.
Okay.
And you also have to. There's no corporate shield. If you mess up, they can come for your house and your car and your savings and all that stuff. That said, there has I wouldn't want to hide this. There has been a move in recent years to more of a different kind of franchise operator.
Okay.
Some of them are incorporated now. Some of them own multiple, even hundreds of locations. Some of them even own locations across multiple chains. And since then, also, there's been a migration. Private equity used to only own the franchise brands, and that's a great business. I mean, it's like Burger King famously has flipped, through private equity owners. All you got to do is get those royalties. Someone else already built the brand. Great, just all it is cash. But since then, there's been private equity franchise operators. So it's a very different dynamic. It's no longer, obviously, a private equity firm is a legal entity, not a person. They can't exert effort. They can hire people that do that. But there is a new breed of franchisee that in some chains that's a little bit different than the old model.
Again, I hate to bring up AI in every single conversation that we do nowadays, but I think it's kind of unavoidable. We have all this new technology, and Joe and I have done plenty of trucking episodes where we talk about, tech that monitors whether people's eyes are open and things like that. Does that new technology play a role in, I guess, exerting more control over some of these franchises?
It absolutely does, and it started in the 1990s with broadband internet, and is accelerating now with AI for sure. Think about like the 1960s, right? You want to have this legal structure where this independent operator is operating the restaurant. They kick me back a royalty. I try to control everything they do, but how can you really control it? There's fax machines, there's telephones, you can send secret shoppers, but there's only so much you can really do. By the 1990s, particularly with broadband internet connected to the cash registers through point of sale systems, there's a steady data stream now going back to headquarters where they have an intense amount of control. And I think one of the interesting things about that technological change is, first of all, in terms of the motivation for these kinds of outsourced industrial structures, it's usually technology is a story. But they started doing this way before the technology. But now that the technology exists, it allows, just think about like a truly vertically integrated corporation like U.S. Steel or General Motors in 1950. The control they have over all of their plants is less than McDonald's that they own. And they employ, those hundreds of thousands of industrial workers. McDonald's now hardly employs anybody, but they have way more control because they're able to get that stream of data. And now the AI has made that surveillance of workers themselves. And by the way, you don't have to fire them if they're too slow at the register. You just send a note to the franchisee, hey, so-and-so, they even know the names of the employees, is a little too slow. Do something about that, so...
Wait, can you say, just talking more about, like, I guess this is theory of the firm type stuff, explain this notion that, like, a U.S. Steel, it's not intuitive to most people, would be a more distributed type of entity than a McDonald's. Why is that? What do you talk, when you say that, what do you mean?
Yeah, so I think, so theory of the firm, I think, no matter your political proclivities, like for, Marx, called it the firm, the hidden boat of production. What happens there is that there's a company there's an entity that owns assets, and there's someone who works, and you put them together, and it happens inside a firm. Coase, the great Chicago conservative economist, had a similar notion where what the nature of the firm is command. A workman doesn't go from department Y to department X because of a change in relative prices, but because he's ordered to do so. So that was sort of the reason why, that's the classical economic reason why firms exist. And then there's, of course, Chandler with his, Visible Hand book, which is, the foundation for most business history of this, is why do we have these big corporations? And his answer was the economics of high throughput and the efficiencies of, if you want to make steel, you can't really rely on the uncertainties of those prices. You kind of want to have everything under control and have managers, sort of running it. And franchising is a little bit what they're trying to do with franchising is get sort of that same type of control, but without having the legal risks and liabilities. And I would say just one more thing is that the legal door that franchisers opened in the 1960s and 1970s has since been, it started as a little loophole. Now it's just a huge, bay door that, an Uber or Amazon can walk through. So, Amazon's fascinating because they are very much like a U.S. Steel in that they try, they found a need to totally reorganize distribution in the United States. They didn't want to rely on USPS. They didn't rely on UPS or FedEx. They brought it all back in-house in economic terms and the fact that they controlled it. But they did not bring it in-house in terms of legal liabilities because those trucks, driving around your neighborhood are independent contractors. and they are able to control them because of this litigation and legislation battles that franchisers fought in the 60s and 70s to legalize those kinds of controls.
Wait, can you talk a little bit more about that? We've never really done a gig economy episode either, I think.
Not in a long time if we have.
Like, what exactly is, I guess, the concrete lineage between the franchise model and the gig economy and the independent contractors?
Yeah, so franchisors in the 1960s and 1970s, don't like the antitrust jurisprudence that says you can't control independent businesses through, I don't know if I've used this term yet, but vertical restraints is like the term of art in antitrust for that. So they go about filing cases to, a very concerted, very smart strategic effort to change the law. They ended up having a huge, very important ally in the University of Chicago economics department and law school who have the same ideas that, we shouldn't be judging, what is this, hoary old idea of the independent entrepreneur? Like, it's efficiency. That's all we care about. So they won those battles in the courts. And then after that, they also were able to head off any after they win those, getting this control, you start seeing the Department of Labor, the National Labor Relations Board, and litigants say, well, wait a minute, all that control, you probably should be responsible, for the underpayment of wages. Or let's say, for example, Domino's, you've got this 30-minute delivery rule. Your driver's speeding to make that delivery, he hits somebody. That's kind of your fault. That's not the franchisee's fault or even the driver's. So they win all these. So they're able to say, well, no, that doesn't really apply to us. They're able to have this sort of have their cake and eat it too. And so that's just that. There's not only any explicit coordination, but once you start getting companies that try to do this with, rather than explicit contractual vertical restraints, it's algorithmic. Here's the route you're going to drive. Here's the price you're going to charge. They're able to do it that way, and that would not have been, or that would have raised some judicial eyebrows if they had tried to do Uber in the 1960s. So, obviously the technology is highly important, but there's the other story I think is important too, is that the fact that these things are legally permissible is the result of franchisers' efforts.
Amazon, Amazon, Uber, do they still use that, like, be your own boss and start your own business rhetoric when they're trying to look for new drivers or little local carriers?
Yeah, they do. But with the Amazon model is even closer to franchising than Uber because, Uber and Lyft, it's each driver is, treated as sort of like an independent entrepreneur. They own their own business. Where be your own boss. And that's probably a powerful thing. I want to be my own boss. I mean, it is, I guess, an American, like a very American, if that's how you, get your nest egg and take care of yourself and your family. But the Amazon is called a delivery service partner or DSP model is much closer to a franchise in that every driver is not an independent entrepreneur. It's the contractor company.
Right. So they might have like 30 or whatever, 30 trucks or whatever.
Yeah, so it's a relatively small business. Amazon, I think, even fronts some of the capital, but it's a legally distinct entity, even though it's painted with the Amazon logo, and tightly controlled.
Since you're an economist, and since you mentioned regressions before, do you have any empirical research about the relationship between the growth of the franchise model and wages in the US? Because again, like if we're talking about the primary lever that an independent franchise owner can actually pull to improve the business, it's all wages.
Yeah, so I don't have that time series of the growth of franchising and the growth of wages, but there are, my work and other work. We do know a couple of things about franchising. One is that if you're a wage worker now, you want to. There's work from Kruger back in the 1990s. There's David Weil, who's I should have mentioned him before. He's like the economist on this stuff. He wrote a book called The Fisher's Workplace, where we do know that if even within the same chain, you want to be at the company-owned one, not at the franchised one, because your wages will be higher. You'll have a higher, tenure wage profile, meaning you're going to get promoted and your wages are going to go up more over time. And also, franchised establishments violate their workers' safety and other rights at a much higher rate than ones that are company-owned. So we do know that stuff, and then we have. My work, we have we were able to take advantage of a really nice natural experiment where Washington State entered a consent decree with McDonald's and a bunch of other chains to get rid of those no poach agreements I mentioned earlier. And we found, maybe not surprising, but there's a causal effect. Once they got rid of those no poach agreements, wages went up. And then, again, because it's very hard, I want to be careful as an economist, it's hard to get those natural experiments. So we don't have that for like specific contract terms. But in work, again, with Marshall Steinbaum and Sergio, we found correlations with lower wages. And then they have a new paper where they look at franchise contracts over time and find that they have gotten more restrictive, even over the past 20 years.
Wait, how do they actually measure that? Now I'm really interested, because if we're talking about, well, I guess I'm interested in how the actual franchisor communicates a lot of the restrictions to the actual business. Like, how do they do that? And then how do you tally that up in an empirical way?
Yeah, so we were very studying franchising. I was very fortunate because these contracts are sort of public records. So there's a requirement from a 1979 Federal Trade Commission rule that requires franchisors to furnish to a franchisee what's called a franchise disclosure document, which in sort of plain English lays out key contract terms, what the royalty is going to be, and basically it's meant to inform the franchisee. The idea being the franchisees are getting swindled into entering these incredibly one-sided contracts. They should know what they're getting into. Let's make a law to disclose that. So that there's this franchise disclosure document, and then usually the franchisor will file as an attachment the entire franchise contract. So we have the contracts, and they're not filed with the FTC, but some states require them to be filed. So you just go to Wisconsin or California. Anyone who wants to do a study on this, you can get the contracts. Back in when I was doing this 10 years ago, I had to read the contracts and hand code them. It took me like 18 months. But I got through 530 contracts, hundreds of contract terms. So we got a pretty good, but it's only a cross section. Yeah. But what my colleagues have been able to do since then is, text recognition software and text scraping abilities and AI. In an afternoon, you could program a computer to just scrape thousands of these contracts, and you can get them over time, which I wasn't able to do. But yes, these are public records, so anyone could do this.
You mentioned treatment of workers and wages at McDonald's franchise locations versus the McDonald's owned and operated locations. What about franchise locations versus just pure independent restaurants? Because this is always seems like one of these things that people don't want to talk about that much, that when we talk about like wages, when we talk about wage theft, and some of these other things, we all like to glorify small businesses, but there's a lot of like these pathologies seem to be fairly prevalent, or more prevalent, I think, at small businesses than say like large corporations. Is that accurate?
I haven't looked at that comparison between independent restaurants and between fast food restaurants. But I think that's a fair case. And I think what franchises are trying to do is capture that small business labor model. And then graft it to a large corporation, but make sure that all the rents go up, to the shareholders and the top corporation, and not be shared with the workers. Where if you're at like Starbucks or a Chipotle, which is totally corporate owned, not saying they have great working conditions, but some of those rents do appear to be shared because wages are higher at Chipotle than Taco Bell, and they're higher at Starbucks than at Dunkin' Donuts. And also Starbucks workers, even they don't have a contract yet, but they were able to at least vote for a union in a way that has never happened in fast food.
Can you explain the logic, either like why companies aren't all franchisees? So first of all, like why would a Chipotle, why did they not go down the franchise route? But why does McDonald's actually have a pretty significant number of owned and operated restaurants?
Yeah, so I think there could be a few reasons for that. One is owning the assets and employing the managers there is a little bit more control that you get there than if it's franchise, and in particular if you don't have the McDonald's model. Or McDonald's, and Ray Kroc talks about this in his book. He really has a hammer over those franchisees in that if they lose that trademark, he can evict them from their own business because McDonald's owns the land. But if you're starting a chain now, you probably don't have the money to actually own all that real estate. So there are those elements of it. But yeah, I think there's also the Chipotles or the Starbucks are a little bit more high end. Like a few cents more. It's not quite the same quality ingredients. It's just a little bit of a different model in the churn out high throughput, low wages as possible model of a franchised fast food restaurant.
You mentioned unions just then, and one of the interesting things in your book, I think it's maybe in the preface or something like that, but you talk about like the legal structure of a franchise. Even if you wanted to unionize or negotiate with the franchisor, it's not entirely legally clear that you can do that because of the corporate structure. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So yeah, so and this is something again that the franchisors were clear this is what they wanted to achieve with their business model. They didn't want to deal with unions, and yeah, so it's up until the 20 teens and the Fight for 15, it was pretty much no one really thought that there was a way for workers who wanted to form a union to negotiate with McDonald's. By the way, McDonald's could willingly do this at any point, but they choose not to.
Yeah.
There's something called the Taft-Hartley Act, which is an anti-labor law from 1947 that makes it illegal for workers. You can't go on strike, you can't picket, you can't target McDonald's Corporation. You can only target your immediate employer. So that creates enormous incentives. Franchising, not coincidentally, takes off after the Taft-Hartley Act. But there had, during the Obama administration, they enacted something called a joint employer rule, which did make it possible or made it easier for workers to say, I really can't, look at the realities of the situation, the economic realities. If I'm to get a raise or I'm going to get better working conditions, we need to bargain with McDonald's because they control the staffing levels, they control the supplies, they control what hours we operate and all that stuff. So that under Obama, of course, it was overturned during Trump. It flipped back during Biden. Now it's flipped back. So it's just no one really knows what their rights are. It's not it's a whole other issue that we could get into. But yeah, so there have been attempts to sort of fix that problem, but we have not fixed it yet.
From a sort of like broader public policy standpoint, I mean, I don't know. My doorbell rings a lot or too much because it's like random like grocery deliveries and stuff like that. But like clearly the Amazon distribution logistics system that they built out, it's clearly more like rapid than the U.S. Postal Service, more flexible, I think, than UPS. How should we think about the sort of like the public benefit of this model that like has made it you can order all kinds of stuff and frequently have it delivered in an hour, which seems pretty nice.
Plus, we do have McDonald's, which
is also great, enjoy. Which we also love. Yeah.
So there are definitely, first of all, there are benefits to the Amazon distribution model. And I think, we should acknowledge those for what they are. There are also costs, and, we should make sure those are counted too.
Yeah.
Whether it's, the pollution in neighborhoods where those distribution centers are, or delivery centers, I should call them. There's the cost to workers, famously peeing in bottle stories.
Sorry, could you just quickly say, you distinguish between distribution centers and delivery centers. So the distribution centers are owned; those are owned by Amazon.
Yeah, so Amazon.
But then they go to a delivery center before they go to your house. They don't. Okay.
Right, and that's where
and the delivery center is not owned by Amazon.
The center is, but the trucking companies. They all go. So if you're a driver for these companies, you show up at an Amazon facility, you put on an Amazon uniform, you drive an Amazon truck, but your employer is one of these contractors. So yeah, I think we should. First of all, we have to account for the cost on workers and other communities and all that kind of stuff. But also, I mean, my proposition for policy here is pretty simple: is that the problem is not that there's innovation, that there's control. That's what a firm is. That's what a corporation is. Markets shouldn't do everything. Sometimes having a little central planner, a mini central planner, coordinating activity is a great thing for, getting more efficient and innovating. So we should have that. The problem is then you can't avoid the obligations and liabilities and risks that go with owning assets and employing workers. And we used to have, our whole legal architecture for regulating and holding these companies accountable was based on that like archetype. We pretty much only, our wave of regulation, was like 1935, to the mid 1960s. And we know what a company is. It has a smokestack, it employs a bunch of workers, and it owns a factory. Like that's what a company is. Now with all of these, and partly due to franchises creating this loophole, it's no longer so clear what an employer is. All I would propose we do is, well, hey, if you want to direct and control the work of these drivers, well, look, you're their employer, and if you're not paying them the legal wages, or if they want to bargain with you for a union, or if because of your algorithm they ran a red light and hit someone, those are all those things you caused. You should be held responsible for those.
All right, Brian Kalachi, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on All Thoughts.
Thank you. I had a great time.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you so much. So,
Joe, that was a fascinating conversation. And I'm really glad we ended up doing a franchise model because Brian truly was the perfect guest. But it's so interesting to hear. I mean, it just kind of blows my mind, the have your cake and eat it too aspect of all of this, right?
No, totally. I mean, look, again, no one has to enter that. Like, right? Like, to me, that's like one of the main things. I did think it was interesting that it really is literally about the intellectual property. Like, that is literally what Coming to America is about a guy who commits intellectual property theft by making something that looks like a McDonald's. But that is the core thing. Most people aren't most people aren't going to be able to manufacture that, et cetera. So being able to plug into that. No, I thought it was like really interesting, the history. I am not surprised at all. The Ray Kroc book is so good. He's so forthright. He's so unself-conscious about everything that he did in life. It's just like a very like weird and fun read for that purpose alone.
I'm gonna have to read it, but I kind of want to read the Colonel Sanders one first.
It's so funny to hear Colonel Sanders, and it's like Ray Kroc and Colonel Sanders. Like, wait, it still feels like that's just like a made-up character.
Really?
Yeah, to me it does. I mean, I knew he was real, but it still feels like that's like a real person.
Do you know about the whole KFC Christmas thing in Japan?
They're really into it, but
because I think it's because Colonel Sanders like kind of looked a little bit like Santa.
Oh, interesting.
So a lot of the Japanese KFCs, at least when I was there, they used to have like big statues of Colonel Sanders out. And it was kind of like,
that's great.
Very American, very Western.
That's a great avatar of American, both cultural and business traditions as Colonel Sanders. I do think like, I always found it weird when the marketing for being an Uber driver or like starting a van line was like either like be your own boss or like start your own business. It's like maybe like the math, look, the left tail is reduced and the right tail is reduced. So there's maybe, and clearly people have done well entering franchise, but they do not look anything like what we typically think of as like, quote, entrepreneurship or business ownership. It's like it's clearly a very different thing.
No, that tension is also remarkable. The idea that like you're an entrepreneur, you're independent, but also the franchisor is going to dictate basically everything to you.
I also just think I like
except wage costs.
Except wage costs. I like that Brian brought up like even the most like Chicago schooled economist is like, no, it's really good, and there are a lot of efficiency gains when you do a lot of activity under a centrally planned umbrella, such as a large corporation, and the sort of like thing that hardly anyone talks about, which is like how much of the economy is literally under central planning. We just don't call it central planning because it's corporate.
Yeah. I mean, yes, there are clearly some benefits to it. And both you and I think you use Amazon Prime, do you?
I do.
Yeah,
yes.
So do I. And McDonald's, of course. Okay, shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
This has been another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway. You can follow me at Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. You can follow me at The Stalwart. Follow our guest, Brian Kalachi. He's at Brian_Kalachi. Follow our producers, Carmen Rodriguez at Carmen Arman, Dashiell Bennett at Dashbot, Cale Brooks at Cale Brooks, and Kevin Lozano at Kevin Lloyd Lozano.
And for more Odd Lots content, you should check out our daily newsletter. You can find that at bloomberg.com/oddlots.
You can chat about all of these topics 24/7 in our Discord, discord.gg/oddlots.
And if you enjoyed this conversation, then please leave a comment or like the video, or better yet, subscribe.
Thanks for watching.